Okay, we'll start. Hello, nice to see you all. Welcome to tonight's lecture, which is organised by the Manton Centre for British Art at Courtauld. I'm Steve Edwards and I'm the director of the centre. The Manton Centre presents an extensive programme of events on art in Britain and its extended territorial networks. And we're extremely grateful to the Manton Foundation and their trustees for their generous support for the Courtauld, the centre and the events programme. Tonight's lecture is presented by Professor Nicholas Till, and the lecture will be about an hour, after which we'll take a few questions and then we'll go next door for a glass of wine. Just a few words about Nick before we start. Nick Till is Emeritus Professor of Opera Studies at both the University of Sussex and the University of Amsterdam. He's the author of a path-breaking study of Mozart and the Enlightenment and editor of the wonderful Cambridge Companion to Opera Studies. He's also a director and producer of opera, both historical and contemporary, and he's regularly appeared on television and radio discussing opera and musical theatre. Most recently, when he hasn't been campaigning for Extinction Rebellion, he's co-edited with Nadia Bauman The History of Hoxton Hall, one of the only surviving Victorian musicals, and that book is now about to be out and it will be published by Exeter University Press. Tonight he's speaking on popular Victorian entertainment at Hoxton Hall, and in fact I recall seeing a reinterpretation of the music hall programme that Nick staged at Hoxton Hall, must be over 10 years ago now.
25
Oh my God. But you know, it was almost a kind of avant-garde reinterpretation of that programme. So this has been a long time in the making. His lecture tonight is entitled First Class Evening Entertainments, Spectacle and Social Control in a Mid-Victorian Music Hall. Join me in welcoming Professor Nick Till.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for inviting me here. And thank you to everyone for turning out on a wet night. I'm extremely touched that people should have trudged through the rain. So I better make it a good show, hadn't I? I'm going to start just by asking how many people in the room know Hoxton Hall? Gosh, that is more than normally when I... that's very interesting because I'm always surprised about how many people who don't know Hoxton Hall. And I usually have to still explain a little bit more about it. But for those of you who don't know Hoxton Hall, here it is. It is in Hoxton Street. It's quite discreetly displays itself. In fact, this here, with the lanterns and the name and the three sort of doorways there, is not the original entrance. That this was made in early 80s. They made a decent entrance because the entrance before, and this is in the late Victorian Edwardian period, there's those three windows, but there's a shop below, and then there's just a little sign saying Hoxton Hall, and there's actually just a little narrow passage up the side there. Maybe people remember that if you've known Hoxton Hall for any length of time, because that was done in the 80s. Now the hall has had a major refurbishment with lottery funding between finished in 2015, and this is the hall before it was refurbished, looking rather charmingly shabby. It has always had character, and when it was in that phase of its life, that also had a certain charm. But this is now what the refurbished hall looks like. A lot of archaeological work was done to try and find out what the building had originally looked like, and that went from finding paint samples to discovering that there were fireplaces and a skylight and things. So they've done a job that allows contemporary performance to take place, but had to be rewired and structurally refitted to allow theatre lighting and things like that. So it's now once again an active social facility and performance venue. Hoxton Hall opened its doors to the public as an entertainment venue in November 1863. We're exceptionally fortunate that a unique range of documents and reports survive to inform us about the distinctive programme that was presented at the hall when it first opened, but also about the wider social context of the hall's construction and management by one James Mortimer, who styled himself as architect, patentee and builder of improved separate dwellings in this application for planning permission to build some housing. We know very little about Mortimer before or after Hoxton Hall. However, from his programme of entertainment for Hoxton Hall, his published housing plans and related social and political activities reported in the local newspaper, the Shoreditch Observer, and from what we know of his associates, we can discern the social and political beliefs that underpinned Mortimer's creation of Hoxton Hall and his associated housing projects. The full programme for the new venue was published in the Shoreditch Observer 5 days after the hall's opening night, with the heading First Class Evening Entertainments. This was unusual, but it's clear that the Shoreditch Observer was closely associated with the Hoxton Hall project. In September 1863, it had printed a lengthy editorial leader with the title Public Amusements and Morality on the state of the leisure and entertainment industry in London, applying some familiar Victorian moralising concerning the association of entertainment venues with idleness, prostitution and alcohol, and clearly adumbrating the social and ideological premises that underpinned the shortly to be launched Hoxton Hall. These aims are then elaborated by Mortimer himself in an address to the public on the opening of Hoxton Hall, also published in the Shoreditch Observer. Now, that's what it looks like on the page in the newspaper, but that makes it a bit more legible, so I've just cut it in half so you can see. This is a lengthy exposition of the principles behind Mortimer's project, characterised as being informed by social science and making the case for why, quote, to cater for the intellectual, healthful, innocent amusement of the masses is to pursue a kindred and congenial path to that which has led and is leading the undersigned to the erection of healthy and happy homes. We'll come back to that conjunction of entertainment and homes. Additional material about the programme is provided by reviews of the opening night on November the 2nd in the Shoreditch Observer of November 7, that's that one, and in a review in the Era, which was the Victorian Time Out, effectively, of the 8th of November. So we have quite a lot of sources for trying to read the programme that I've just showed you. Now, the programme itself, whose content Mortimer promised would vary from night to night, offers an eclectic mix of information, news and current affairs, billed as an original sensation story, offering prominent features of the news of the day derived from special sources, that's how I described, education, a talk on the Prince of Wales's recent tour in the East, illustrated with magic lantern slides, education, an illustrated talk on healthy moral homes, a history of the great battles of the British Army, from Hastings to Inkerman, a different battle every night, and entertainment, magic and animal acts, music and storytelling. It is a mix not unlike that of public service broadcasting. Sorry, let's just get that back up again so you can see what I'm talking. It is a mix not unlike that of public service broadcasting. In this talk, I will offer a discussion of the individual components of the programme and an analysis of the programme overall as an example of the mid-Victorian project to exercise social control over the growing urban working classes through a range of ideological and disciplinary regimes, many of which concentrated on the provision of urban leisure. The programme clearly presents the cognitive realms of modernity, and identified by Max Weber as the three autonomous spheres of science, morality, and art. But the Hoxton programme also anticipates the means by which ideology typically operates through deliberate confusion of these categories. In the fields of information, education, and entertainment, knowledge realms once assumed to be safely self-contained by those who drew up the original charter of the BBC, the slippery categories of infotainment and edutainment are offered instead. The spheres of information, education, and entertainment may remain notionally distinct at Hoxton Hall, but as the prospectus cited in the Era makes clear, James Mortimer planned the hall, in quote, with the specific object of affording to the humbler classes an entertainment that shall combine instruction with amusement, to form a nucleus for the regeneration, as it were, of that class of mankind who, even in the present enlightened century, have not an idea beyond the pothouse bar and ribaldry that appertains thereto. From the mid-19th century, the Victorian ruling classes recognised that in creating an urban working class, they had given birth to a slumbering monster that had merely flexed its muscles in the mass political movement of the age, Chartism. By 1863, the East End of London had begun to gain its fearful reputation for overcrowding, poverty, disease, and crime. In Shoreditch, the population numbers reached a peak in 1861 before the outer expansion of London began to relieve pressure on the inner city. With the collapse of Chartism in 1848, the ruling classes seized the initiative to implement an active programme of social control and ideological education. In a period in which it is estimated that only 3% of the population read daily newspapers, the new ideological doxa had primarily to be transmitted orally and visually, for which public entertainment venues provided the perfect vehicle. During the 1850s, there emerged an extensive campaign to promote what was called rational recreation in Britain. Hoxton Hall was clearly part of this project, the entertainments being described in the Shoreditch Observer as of a most pleasing and rational character. The 1863 Hoxton programme was intended to contribute to the social project of forging a hard-working, self-improving, loyal, patriotic, and ultimately docile working class. The Victorian faith in technological progress as a driver of social improvement, narratives of national identity, the new imperial mission, and a monarchy worthy of sentimental devotion are all represented. But as Deleuze and Guattari remind us, modern power is not at all reducible to the classical alternative repression or ideology, but implies processes of normalization, modulation, modeling and information that bear on language, perception, desire, movement, etc., which proceed by way of micro-assemblages. Hoxton Hall can be seen as an experimental crucible for just an array of micro-assemblages. The Era describes Hoxton Hall in 1863 as a music hall, a designation that reflects its licensing status. The 1843 Theatres Act had expanded the number of theatres permitted to present plays, but not if refreshments were served in the auditorium. Proprietors wishing to serve such refreshments, the good drop of beer advertised by Mortimer, had to seek a music license instead. Music halls had developed in Britain in the 1840s as a means of organising and commercialising the more informal musical entertainment offered until that time, largely in pubs, tavern concert rooms, song and supper clubs, and singing saloons. Musical venues of this kind became some of the most important locations of urban leisure during the 1840s, and social reformers were quick to spot the potential offered by such spaces to combine social enjoyment with wholesome instruction. That was a quote. In 1862, the manager of Wilton's Music Hall in the working class area of Whitechapel, which had opened in had opened in 1859, claimed that the decrease of drunkenness and breaches of the peace in the East End since the 1840s could be attributed to, quote, nothing else but the establishment of cheap and rational entertainment with which these music halls have provided for, for the working classes of this country. And the benefits were not just with regard to crime and drunkenness. As one proprietor made clear in 1851, is not the working man more beneficially, more properly and less harmfully employed when listening to such music and innocent entertainments than he would be drinking and smoking in some tap room, talking politics until he becomes a Chartist or a rebellious Democrat dangerous to society? But of course, the entertainments were hardly innocent. That's just a quote. The rest of the little captions are from the original programme. Many of the contemporary depictions of descriptions and depictions of Victorian music halls admire their brilliant illumination. In 1858, Charles Dickens visited the Britannia Theatre in Hoxton Street, just opposite Hoxton Hall, where it was licensed for plays rather than music, so it wasn't direct competition. Dickens visited the Britannia and noted that it was magnificently lighted by a firmament of sparkling chandeliers. But let us cast more light on the meaning of so much light. For within these palaces of glitter and dazzle, the illusions of ideology did not need to be secured through subterfuge. They were brazenly displayed as spectacle. Robert Houdin, identified as the founder of modern stage magic in the 1840s, explicitly advocated the importance of good lighting for his act. The conjurer had nothing to hide. But the real trick lay in the disciplinary effect of the illumination itself, which was turned not upon the performers on stage, but upon the audience. Music halls were spaces in which the poor of the East End, enticed from their visibility in underlit pothouses and slums, or from the teeming nomadic life of the streets. Nomadic is the term employed by the Victorian social reformer Henry Mayhew in his book London Labour and the London Poor, he wrote between 1851 and 61. People enticed from the nomadic life of the streets could be contained and exposed to the light of surveillance. Thus, Hoxton Hall may be recognised as a part of the general project of 19th century urbanisation described by the French situationist Guy Debord. After the French Revolution, the efforts of all established powers to increase the means of maintaining order in the streets finally culminates in the suppression of the street. The general movement of isolation, which is the reality of urbanism, must also include a controlled reintegration of workers depending on the need of production and consumption that can be planned. Integration into the system requires that isolated individuals be recaptured and isolated together. factories and halls of culture, tourist resorts and housing developments are expressly organised to serve this pseudo-community. The board gives us a hint here as to why Mortimer and the Shoreditch Observer should have considered housing and recreation for the working classes to be associated projects. Writing about another aspect of this social process, Michel Foucault describes a new panoptic architecture, quote, that is no longer built simply to be seen, as with the ostentation of palaces, but to permit an internal, articulated and detailed control, to render visible those who are inside it, end quote. Such buildings are described by Foucault as being like so many small theatres for the display of subjects as actors. At the Britannia Theatre, across the street from Hoxton Hall, Dickens had observed that as a theatre catering almost exclusively for a working class audience, it did not have to maintain the usual spatial distinctions of class. Here, he says, they were not put away in a dark gap in the roof of an immense building. They were in possession of eligible points of view. Instead of being at a great disadvantage in comparison with the mass of the audience, they were here the audience for whose accommodation the place was made. But if the audience was in possession of eligible points of view, they were at the same time, of course, viewable. And Dickens did indeed comment upon the appearance of what? appearance of the audience as seen from the proscenium, with every face in it commanding the stage, and the whole so admirably raked and turned to the centre that a hand can scarcely move in the great assemblage without the movement being seen from thence. Of the Canterbury Music Hall in Westminster Bridge Road, the first music hall to be so designated, a journalist could claim when it opened in 1852 that the magnificent and brilliantly lighted hall in which the concert is held exercises no little influence upon the morals of the audience. As Foucault and others insist, panopticism is about more than simply surveillance. The panoptic society works to produce subjects through the imposition of an array of self-regulating disciplinary regimes. At the cheaper penny gaff music halls in Shoreditch, dark and rowdy, police had to be deployed to ensure that order was maintained. At the Britannia, however, Dickens was able to observe that the audience policed itself, ejecting anyone who was disruptive, and thereby keeping excellent order, in his words. Jonathan Crary has described the inculcation of attentiveness in both work and leisure as one of the most important disciplinary devices of the 19th century. Through the attentiveness that the new forms of entertainment demanded, working class audiences were to be inducted into standards of public decorum and manners that were deemed essential for their new role as respectable public citizens and subjects. An effect recorded by the journalist and literary historian Henry Morley when observing an audience at Sadler's Wells Theatre. Quote, "There sat our working classes in a happy crowd, as orderly and reverent as if they were at church, and yet as unrestrained in their enjoyment as if listening to stories told them by their own firesides." At Hoxton Hall, whose prices of 3d, 6d and 9d indicate that it was clearly aimed at a better class of audience than the infamous penny gaffs down the road, the newspapers could similarly describe the first night audience as, quote, "crowded and well conducted, whose attention appeared as fully absorbed in the news conveyed in the latest telegrams from America and the insurrection in Poland as in the harmony sent forth by members of the Orpheus Quartet Union, or in the dissolving views illustrative of the Prince of Wales's tour in the East. Dissolving views, it means projectors, projectors that you could go merge from one. Steve probably can explain better how they work, but rather than just like click, 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 they were meant to sort of blend into each other. The opening chorus by the Orpheus Quartet is not detailed in the programme, but would have undoubtedly been something suitably rousing. Apart from the glees, 4-part songs, sung to accompany the slideshow of the Prince of Wales's tour to the East, the remaining musical numbers are unfortunately also unidentified. Even if the musical component of the Hoxton Hall programme might essentially have been considered an item of entertainment, Victorian educators could nonetheless find many justifications for the disciplinary uses of music. Dr. K. Shuttleworth, the government's education advisor in the 1840s, argued that singing was, quote, an important means of forming an industrious, brave, loyal, and religious working class. Shuttleworth's faith in the moral effects of singing would have been founded upon the value of participatory music making. This was indeed the basis of the entertainments offered in the tavern concert rooms and song and supper clubs, which were increasingly being superseded by professional music hall performers. The development of the music hall proper from the 1850s must be seen as an aspect of the general trend towards the professionalisation and commercialisation of music in the 19th century. Participatory musical activity was to be increasingly relegated to the home as an aspect of domestic leisure for which specific forms of music could be marketed. In particular, the glees, written by hugely successful composers such as Sir Henry Bishop, composer of Home Sweet Home and Britain's first musical night. At the same time, the boisterous and often subversive cultural production of the street, operating according to pre-capitalist economic principles, was to be controlled and commodified through the establishment of supervised commercial venues. The presentation of what were a largely domestic glees at Hoxton Hall in 1863 occupies a transitional space as a signifier of class respectability, offered in contrast to those newer, less respectable forms of musical entertainment being developed in the more popular commercial music hall. In particular, the newly popular solo character songs. These are some of the purveyors of character songs, including William Linwood, who performed often in drag. Mayhew informs us that in the 1850s, when there were still many itinerant glee singers working the streets, these often consisted of family groups. One such family complained vigorously to Mayhew that the new character songs were now, quote, now more approved of in concert rooms than bishops. Mayhew's informants, who are proud of their high musical education, are dismissive of such character songs, noting that they are often lewd and improper. The Orpheus Quartet may perhaps have been just such an itinerant family group, often resorting to knocking on the doors of middle-class houses to offer their services. Such a group would surely have been well contented had Mortimer offered them a regular contract to sing their more old-fashioned, respectable glees. The glees served as that part of the programme which worked effectively, operating beneath the basic economy of rational positivism and scientism, which informs much of the programme, to reinforce its message through a subliminal appeal to the feelings, as in film music. Adorno and Eisler, in their book on film music, offer an account of this function of film music as, quote, an extreme version of the general function of music under conditions of industrially controlled cultural consumption. Music is supposed to bring out the spontaneous, essentially human element in its listeners and in virtually all human relations. More specifically, they suggest that it was the function of music to drown the whirring mechanical film image of the silent era or the rattling magic lantern projector, quote, which otherwise arouses the consciousness of one's own mechanization. So, the first act in the show. Professor Legrinia, the royal conjurer and great ambidextrous is a word I can never say. Someone shout it out for me.
Digital.
Well done, thank you. Entertainment of magical illusions in introducing the wonderful performing Russian cat, learned canary birds and white mice. Like music, magic and animal acts have migrated from the street to the stage during the early 19th century, changing in the process. Robert Houdin had insisted on a distinction between pre-Enlightenment magic, founded on the pretense of supernatural powers, and modern magic, presented in the words of James Cook in his book, The Arts of Deception, as an explicitly disenchanted form of theatrical entertainment, which emphasized manual dexterity, mechanical and scientific effects. Cook describes the way in which Victorian magicians carefully deployed the rituals of the lecture to give authority to their acts, adopting, quote, a bourgeois form of dress, the tuxedo, stage design, much in the style of a Victorian parlour, and public rhetoric. They referred to their performances as scientific exercises designed to instruct rather than deceive. The Hoxton Hall conjurer, Professor Lagrinia, was clearly assuming this guise when he designated himself with the quasi-academic title of Professor Lagrinia. By 1863, Professor Lagrinia had enjoyed a career as a musician in established and reputable venues in London, such as the Royal Polytechnic Institute, Crystal Palace and Sadler's Wells, where in 1855 he was judged by the era to be decidedly an accomplished artiste in the science of mystery. But like Mayhew's vocal quartet, Lagrinia also worked the streets. In an article written 20 or so years ago, I surmised that he might have been the same street exhibitor of birds and mice whom Henry Mayhew encountered in Shoreditch in 1861, and who also worked with a trained cat and 10 canaries. Of the canaries, he explained to Mayhew, I have names for them all. I have Mr. and Mrs. Courtauld, dressed quite in character. They quarrel at times, and that's self-talk with them. They ride out in a chariot drawn by another bird. Then I have Marshal Ney in full uniform, and he fires a cannon to keep up the character. A more detailed account of Professor Lagrinia's act that has turned up subsequently to my finding that Mayhew, this encounter in Mayhew, given the year after his appearance at Hoxton Hall at the annual fete in aid of the Great Western Railway Widows and Orphans Fund in Aldermaston Park in Reading, confirms that he was indeed Mayhew's street entertainer. And there is an account of his performance that gives us a bit more detail. But we ought not to have mentioned last Professor Lagrinia's performing cat, birds and mice, which were exhibited in a tent at a small charge and affording much wonderment to hosts of spectators. The birds, at the mere word of command, ascend and descend a ladder, taking an airing, duly habited, in a carriage drawn by one of their number, and execute other surprising manoeuvres, while Grimalkin, it's an old-fashioned name for a cat, so that's where the cat is, who lives in the same cage with them on the most amiable terms, with the utmost nonchalance, steps out and fires a mimic cannon at one of the feathered tribes supposed to have committed the offence of desertion, and which incontinently falls down as though it had received the coup de grace. The mice have been taught to ascend poles and bring down in their mouths whatever is placed at the summit. As variously described, Lagrinia's act, hardly a conventional magic act, offers a perfect metaphor for the control of the supposedly animalistic natures of the urban working classes that the Victorian social reformers so desired. Art historian Caroline Arscott has demonstrated the way in which the numerous Victorian animal paintings exhibited at the South London Art Gallery in Peckham, the gallery specifically intended for working class people, were also employed to this end. Referring to egregiously sentimentalized paintings of families of domestic rabbits, Arscott suggests that, quote, at one level, these well-behaved and contented rabbits offer a straightforward equivalent to the working class audience that the organisers of the South London Art Gallery wished to see. Yet how could this marauding pest with libertine-breeding habits and cowardly disposition turn tail to become the object of emotional identification? This was, of course, the function of the paintings. Ascot also tells us that rabbit farmers' handbooks of the period are filled with discussion about the most effective and economical means of providing heating and ventilation for hutches. Ventilation was an important issue of the greatest concern amongst Victorian housing reformers such as Mortimer. Ascot concludes that all of this translates very easily into the terms of the social policy of the interventionist state, or the measures proposed by paternalist philanthropy. With reference to the problematically cowardly disposition of the rabbit working class man, the military apparatus of Logrinia's birds subjects the beasts to a very specific kind of disciplinary regime, which had also been extended to the ordinary working man when the Civil Defence Volunteer Movement was founded in 1859. The fact that the authorities considered it safe to allow tens of thousands of working class men to carry arms was itself a sign of post-Chartist confidence, but the payoffs were clear. Not only would it make working men, in the words of a contemporary enthusiast, more attached to the government in every way and less likely ever to promote political agitation, there were also more immediate disciplinary advantages. Quote, it would impart unto the youth of the nation obedience, promptitude, and self-respect, and provide a safe and salutary occupation for the increasing hours of leisure at men's disposal. Professor Logrinia's display of well-trained animals would also have served to reinforce the message about the value of military discipline in the presentation that followed. A talk on the great battles of the British Army, from Hastings to Inkerman, by Mr. John McGilchrist. This item was presented by John McGilchrist, who was evidently James Mortimer's partner in the Hoxton Hall project, and whose well-documented political, social, and educational views clearly confirm the reading of the ideological objectives of the project presented hitherto. McGilchrist was a journalist, writer, and a popular educationalist, the author of exemplary biographies of great Victorians. He was also engaged in political agitation for the parliamentary representation of working people and smaller tradesmen, a topic on which he spoke at a public meeting held at the newly opened Hoxton Hall, advertised in the Shoreditch Observer, which also supported the policy. McGilchrist's views were typical of the petty bourgeois radicalism of the period, maintaining a clear distinction between political and social economic rights, according to which, as he wrote in a book of essays on social and political matters published in 1857, social inequality is a natural difference. Political inequality is an error and a wrong. McGilchrist's electoral rights, to be fulfilled in the Second Reform Act of 1867, were also limited to the respectable working classes, ruling out the undeserving poor. Quote, there are whole classes of men, amounting to hundreds of thousands in this community, who possess no kind of fitness. They are incompetent, from extreme ignorance or vicious habits to the performance of the most ordinary duties of social life. Like most Victorian reformers, McGilchrist made an essential distinction between the feckless and the deserving poor. His talks on battles alternated in the Hoxton programme with another series entitled The Story of the Lives of Poor Men Who Have Risen from the Ranks, based on his book Men Who Have Made Themselves, Whence They Started, How They Journeyed, What They Reached. It was an aspirational but also judgmental theme that would have chimed well with the ideology of that classic Victorian bestseller, would be an airport bestseller if it was today, Samuel Smiles' Self-Help of 1859, whose philosophy of self-improvement had been promoted in a Shoreditch Observer article on the sanitary condition of Shoreditch, that concluded that if the working classes are to be elevated above their present condition, they must do it themselves. McGilchrist's talk on the great battles of the British Army from Hastings to Inkerman, a different battle promised every night, up to the most recent, Inkerman being a major victory of the Crimean War, would have been derived from another of his books, The Military Heroes of England, also published in 1863. It represents a typical contribution to the construction of approved historical narratives of national identity during the Victorian era. In its positive portrayal of the British Army, it also conformed to the specific agenda of the period to transform the public image of a body whose credibility had been seriously damaged by the disastrous management of the Crimean War. Representations of the Crimean War had formed a regular item in popular theatrical representations during the war, presented as part of a move to sustain public support for the war effort and to counter the damaging reports of political and military incompetence that had reached the public. After the war, major reforms of the British Army had been undertaken by the Courtauld Commission, and these were accompanied by a vigorous campaign to promote a new image. The project was both practical and ideological, as explained by the historian of imperial culture John Mackenzie, who notes that due to the Courtauld reforms and the success of the volunteer movement, the army, quote, lost its old unpopularity and became a central element in national life. Cults of heroes from both distant and more recent past were assiduously promoted through children's literature, a powerful iconography, and the new education. McGilchrist's history of the British Army and its military heroes is clearly part of this project, with its boy's own endorsement of the spirit of heroism and sacrifice represented by the British Army. Mr. McGilchrist was kept busy. Press reviews elucidate the item described in the programme as original sensation story, which consisted of, quote, news conveyed in the latest telegrams from America and the insurrection in Poland. The title of this item draws quite clearly on the lurid promotional language of street broadsheet sellers, but may also be seen as a precursor of the commodification of news as spectacle purveyed by the later Victorian mass media. The item also conveys the typical Victorian faith in science and technology, clearly conveyed in Mortimer's pride in his oxyhydrogen limelight projector, described in his address to the public as, quote, a scientific appliance which excels the old magic lantern of our childhood as much as the locomotive of today does that of Tredinick, or the loom of the modern factory does the obsolete spinning jenny. Demonstrations of new scientific and technological developments, such as the telegraph, were a favourite item of mid-Victorian public entertainments. Science historian Bernard Lightman explains that, as the great exhibition had shown, this new audience was attracted to exhibitions and displays that presented science as spectacle. Scientific spectacles were designed to overwhelm the senses with a feeling of awe and wonder. We might say that Victorian magic, while disenchanting pre-rational magic, spectacularized and re-enchanted science. The telegraph, which is the object of this presentation, was hardly new by 1863. It had been developed extensively throughout Britain in the 1840s and was used for police investigation, news reporting, and railway timetabling, amongst other things. Like the railways, the telegraph had also contributed enormously to the development of trade and commerce, as well as proving its military value in the Crimean War. But the ultimate challenge was submarine cables, and the international race to be the first to lay key submarine cables played the same role in national morale and prestige as the space race in the last century. Submarine cables had allowed direct communication between London and Paris by 1852. And in 1858, the first transatlantic cable was laid, an event which was widely celebrated in a book, that was hastily published in 1858 to capture the moment, in which the cable was described as the greatest event in the present century, showing that nothing is impossible to man. An 1861 map of the telegraph network of the London District Telegraph Company shows that a telegraph line, which would have been slung across the rooftops, ran from the company's own main office in Shoreditch to Dalston along Hoxton Street. The Hoxton entertainments took place at a crucial moment in the American Civil War between the Battle of Gettysburg in July and Lincoln's Gettysburg Address on November 19th. Like the concurrent Polish insurrection against the Russians, the progress of the anti-slavery unionists in the American Civil War was a matter of keen interest to the kind of British liberal opinion represented by McGilchrist and Mortimer. Yet the promise of news conveyed in the latest telegrams from America and the insurrection in Poland is a little misleading. The first transatlantic telegraph cable had ceased to work after a month. News of its failure was kept under wraps for as long as possible, leading to speculation that the whole thing had in fact been an elaborate hoax. The second and permanent cable was not laid until 1866. How then could the latest news have been brought by telegraph from America in 1863? The Shoreditch Observer explains, "It is news that has been ventilated between the time the morning papers have been published and that at which they were recounted. That's to say, the news had not been telegraphed direct from America, which would indeed have been magic, but from an office in London." Mortimer had promised his customers that the Hoxton Hall entertainments would be constantly varied. The Evening Standard reports on the opening evening's contents and gives an indication of this variety. The programme comprised a variety of short and pithy lectures of an instructive and amusing nature, a statement of the principal events of the day, such as proceedings of the police courts, foreign news, betting, money, corn and commercial markets. These were McGilchrist's original sensation stories. James Mortimer himself gave a presentation in his new hall, on homes of the people as they are and as they might be. James Mortimer's own contribution to the programme for which he built Hoxton Hall was a talk entitled "Homes of the People as They Are and as They Might Be." In this talk, Mortimer presented plans and a model for his improved dwellings for the working classes. Show house examples of these had already been erected by Mortimer near New Cross Station in South London, having been announced and advertised as cottage residences with gardens in the Shoreditch Observer earlier in the year, with the additional support of an editorial puff entitled "Healthy and Cheap Suburban Residences for the Industrial Classes of the Metropolis." The issue of working class housing had been a topic in the first public event to take place at Hoxton Hall on the 22nd of October 1863 at a meeting to discuss dwellings of the poor in Bethnal Green and Shoreditch, at which Mortimer presented an illustrated talk on his housing development in New Cross. And this is the prospectus that he had drawn up. He had applied for a patent and permission to, he secured the permission to build this estate, which unfortunately was pulled down in the 1960s, so we don't have any much record of it. Yes, at this meeting held to discuss dwellings of the poor. The secretary for the meeting was none other than John McGilchrist, and to give an indication of the prominence of the event, the meeting was chaired by George Cruikshank, former political cartoonist and illustrator of Dickens's Oliver Twist. And an ardent advocate of alcoholic abstinence. In his address to the meeting, he blamed working class poverty on drunkenness, a portent of Hoxton Hall's own future as the home of a temperance organisation. The meeting concluded with two resolutions. The first, that the overcrowding in dwellings in Bethnal Green and Shoreditch, quoting now, along with such attendant evils as disease, intemperance, unchastity, and infanticide, constitute the crying evil of the day. The second, that among the remedies most calculated to remedy this deplorable state of things, the erection of commodious and well-ventilated dwellings, let at rentals within the means of humbler classes, and a substitution of less immoral but equally entertaining amusements for those which now unfortunately form almost the only staple recreation offered, have a claim upon the attention of a benevolent public. So again, we've got houses and entertainment bundled together. The truth is that Mortimer was partly using, of course, his new hall and talks and presentations I think he did there to promote his building schemes in South London. So he was in the way he presented these two problems as he bundled them up together. The mover of that resolution concludes that if the home was not comfortable, it was not to be wondered at that the blazing lights of the gin shop should drag him, the working man, away. This is followed by a motion by McGilchrist endorsing Mortimer's suburban dwellings and Mortimer's presentation of his slideshow for his designs, recently approved by the Metropolitan Board of Works, which concludes with an assertion that the venture was not a charity and that investment in the scheme would bring a return of 12%, a sum far greater than the normally achieved 3.5 to 5% dividend. Mortimer's prospectus encapsulates a number of Victorian ideas on housing and poverty. In the same year as Hoxton Hall, St Leonard's Workhouse at the top of Hoxton Street was rebuilt to house 1,200 inmates. These were people whose poverty condemned them to live in prison-like conditions, whilst those who were fit worked in a stonebreaker's yard alongside Hoxton Hall. Part of the workhouse building survives, this part of it. I remember, though, in the early 80s when the rest of the workhouse building was there. I mean, sort of barrack-like, grim barrack-like building. Part of the workhouse building survives with its opening date and official name, Offices for the Relief of the Poor, emblazoned on its facade. The working classes who were not poor enough for the workhouse were housed in appalling conditions, provided almost entirely by private landlords. Overcrowding was normal, and insanitary conditions contributed to high mortality rates. Public concern about housing was initially aroused by fears concerning public health. The slums bred and transmitted illness and disease from which even the ruling classes in the West End were not immune, as had become evident from outbreaks of cholera and typhoid in 1837 and 1838, forcing the government to take action over matters such as urban sewage infrastructure, a topic discussed by the Shoreditch Observer in its leader of the 31st of October, with the proposal that human sewage should be processed for fertiliser. That's a discussion that we're still having today. The 1848 and 1875 Public Health Acts gave local councils the power to inspect and regulate housing standards, and the 1868 Artisans and Labourers Dwellings Act gave local authorities powers to clear slums. But until the formation of the London County Council in the 1890s, local boroughs lacked the power to provide public housing, and alternative housing was provided by private bodies such as the Society for Improving the Conditions of the Labouring Classes, the General Society for Improving the Dwellings of the Working Classes, and the Peabody Trust, the first of whose typically barrack-like but solidly built tenements, lost that one, Okay. Was completed in 1864, so just a year after Hobson Hall, and continued to house the industrious poor of the capital. Many of these ventures were run on commercial principles. The founding articles of the Metropolitan Association for Improving the Dwellings of the Industrial Classes, stating that the association would provide the labouring man with the increase of the comforts and conveniences of life with full compensation to the capitalists. So they've got their priorities right. Aside from health, the other issue that concerned Victorian housing reformers was morality, the possibility of sexual activity and even incest occurring in multiple occupancy housing conditions, which is alluded to by Mortimer in his notice when he says, "There are but few must have observed the heart-rending sufferings experienced and immoralities practiced when no separation of the sexes, much less families, is carried out. And this constitutes the great social want even of the more genteel portion of society." The Sir John Simon report of 1865 on public health and housing discreetly raised this issue that was more directly addressed in the Royal Commission of 1884-5, which eventually led to the 1890 Housing of the Working Classes Act. The majority of schemes for housing the working classes assumed high-density inner-city tenements as the best solution. However, by the 1850s, there were a number of proposals being made for workers to be housed in the suburbs, thanks to improved railway links to the city and government legislation requiring railway companies to provide cheap commuter fares for the working classes. Mortimer's scheme makes reference to the nearness of his housing to New Cross Station, which links to Shoreditch in 15 minutes. Suburbanisation mitigated the overcrowding of the city centre and had the advantage of removing the working classes beyond the city, where they were less troublesome, and where their radicalism could be blunted and eventually their voting power diluted. In this respect, Mortimer's projects were in advance of his time, preceding the hitherto first recorded suburban housing scheme for working people, built by the Metropolitan Association for improving the dwellings of the industrious classes in Beckenham in 1866, and they are actually still standing. Finally, there is a clear correlation between the social objectives of Mortimer's domestic and public architectural projects, the healthy moral dwellings for the poor, full of light and air, and the well-lit and well-ventilated spaces of Hobson Hall, offering, in the words of his opening address, intellectual, healthful, and innocent amusement for the masses. The architectural journal The Builder made this correlation explicit when it suggested that the hygienic facilities of the Britannia Theatre might indeed serve to induce habits of cleanliness in the unwashed. Now, I'm looking at the time because I've run up against the hour, and we still have a couple of items. So I think rather than my reading them, my carefully crafted script, I will just speak to the slides. So the next item is a slideshow headed "The Prince of Wales Tour in the East." Now, this period of the early 1860s was really the low ebb of support in the Victorian period for the monarchy. Prince Albert had died in 1861, and his son, Prince Edward, the Prince of Wales, had embroiled himself in various sexual scandals. Yes, I know what you're thinking. The Queen was immensely unpopular. She used to appear in public. She had buried herself away in Windsor. There was actually what one historian describes as the most significant anti-monarchic movement at that particular moment in our history. Albert, before he died, had decided that he would pack his son off to visit the Middle East, and he was sort of spun as a sort of spiritual journey that he was going to make to these sort of biblical lands. Of course, he was also going to do some handy work ensuring the British imperial interests were maintained with the right to people in charge in these various countries. But this basically, the whole idea of trying to restore or even create a notion of the monarchy as sort of representing a kind of ideal bourgeois family comes from this period. And there's one quote I do need to find, where it's Mayhew again, who finds a lad in a street, a lad in the street who, let me just, a bird seller in the street, who I can't see it now, but who says, Mayhew says, what does he know about the Queen? And he says, what's the Queen to me? I don't. She means nothing to me. Mayhew is very shocked by this. That someone should have this attitude. I mean, the boy's right, of course, but this is part of what this particular sort of Victorian thing of restoring the monarchy and creating this idealized version of the monarchy. So the interesting thing here is that this particular tour was the first time that a photographer was attached to the royal delegation, called Francis Bedford, and lots of venues, education venues and things like that, at this moment were doing talks about this event. They were sort of picking up the palace, the palace script, and showing these slides. I didn't know. I knew that what the program tells us about the tour. We can see where he went. But what I didn't know was about from when I first researched this 20 years ago. I didn't know about Francis Bedford, and then in 2014, the Queen's Gallery put on an exhibition of these images. Oh, right. Yeah, which have been produced as a very nice book. It's in the Royal Collection, basically. These photographs. So that's just another, the monarchy, a new concept of the monarchy is another sort of plank in the whole picture. And I can't remember what comes next, if anything, but I think we've more or less reached, gone through all of the
slides.
That is basically one of the slides that is images that is identified in the program is this image of, or not this image, but I mean a photograph of what's called the Pharaoh's bed in Philae, and that's the nearest bit of evidence of that it might have. That image might have been used in Hoxton Hall. The curator of the show said it was very likely they would have made slides because there was a desperate demand all the time for sets of slides, usually accompanied by these slides look like glass slides, and they They were massively distributed, and they usually had a script with them. So, and in the program, we're told that there's a script being spoken when they're showing these slides. So, I think you've probably got the idea by now. The last two items, one is last item is the reading of a story called The Tale of a Tiger and a Tub, which was very popular in Victorian Britain, and it used, again, slides, and these actually have, that's a set of slides that could have been used. And that also is a story about humans, but maybe white humans, disabling. Basically, they managed to capture some Bengal tigers, put him in a tub, and then his tail is sticking out their dusk. But it's another little narrative about controlling wild animals and so on. So I'll wrap it up there.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you.